The wind, a biting whisper off Lake Erie, snaked through the rows of granite and marble, rustling the dead leaves clinging to the oaks that lined the cemetery. A cold Wednesday morning in Toledo, the sky a bruised gray, mirroring the hollowness that had taken root in Grant Ellison's chest. For days since they'd laid his son to rest, the earth swallowing him whole, a finality that even now, standing before the freshly turned soil, Grant couldn't comprehend. His chauffeured car, a gleaming obsidian beast, felt out of place amidst the somber quiet, an unwelcome intrusion of a world he couldn't escape. He stepped out, the polished leather of his shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. His suit, impeccably tailored, offered little warmth against the chill that permeated not just the air, but his very being. He hadn't wanted to come. He'd told himself it was unnecessary, this ritualistic revisiting of grief. He'd said his goodbyes, or what passed for them at the funeral. A sterile, public display of mourning that felt as hollow as the mahogany casket. But some unacknowledged need to bridge the chasm between himself and the son he'd barely known had drawn him back. He approached the grave, the polished granite gleaming dully under the overcast sky. Marcus Ellison. The inscription read, stark and unforgiving. Dates that bookend a life, Grant realized, with a pang of guilt he hadn't truly been a part of. A figure kneeling before the headstone caught his eye. A young woman, her back to him, her shoulders hunched against the wind. She held something bundled in her arms, a swathe of pale blue. An acquaintance, perhaps? One of the many faces that had blurred together in the receiving line, offering condolences he hadn't truly heard. He hesitated, a flicker of annoyance rising within him. This was his moment, his private reckoning. He cleared his throat, a small sound lost in the rustling leaves. The woman turned, her face pale, etched with a weariness that resonated deep within him. And then he saw it. The bundle in her arms wasn't a blanket. It was a baby with a shock of dark hair, a tiny, perfect replica of the face that haunted Grant's dreams. Time seemed to fracture, splintering into 1,000 shards of disbelief. The wind, the cold, the very ground beneath his feet ceased to exist. Only the child, the undeniable echo of his son, remained. He stared, unable to speak, the carefully constructed wall of composure crumbling around him. The woman rose, her movements slow and deliberate, clutching the child closer. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, met his unwavering. "Who are you?" he finally managed, the words rough, unfamiliar in the silence. His mind raced, grasping at explanations, each more improbable than the last. A secret marriage? A child he'd never known existed? The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow, a mixture of shock and a strange, nascent hope. "I didn't mean to intrude," the woman said, her voice soft, tinged with a sadness that mirrored his own. He took a step closer, drawn by an invisible force. He needed to see the child's face, to confirm the impossible truth that his heart already knew. "I'm Grant," he said, the words catching in his throat. "Marcus' father." The silence that followed stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken words. The woman's eyes, filled with a complex mix of grief and something else, something that looked suspiciously like defiance, held his gaze. "I'm Janelle," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She shifted the baby slightly, and Grant saw his son's face, miniature and perfect, looking back at him. A tear, hot and unwelcome, traced a path down his cheek. He hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't allowed himself the indulgence of grief. But now, faced with this tiny, fragile life, the dam broke. "This is," he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Calvin," Janelle said, her gaze softening. "Marcus's son." The name, a simple, strong name, resonated within him. His grandson. The word felt foreign, yet strangely fitting. He reached out a hand, hesitantly, towards the child. Janelle didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She allowed him to touch the baby's tiny hand, his finger engulfed by a surprisingly strong grip. A connection, a fragile thread spun across the chasm of loss. linking him to a future he hadn't known existed. He looked at Janelle, really looked at her, seeing the exhaustion etched on her face, the quiet strength in her eyes. This woman, this young woman he didn't know, carried a piece of his son within her arms, a piece he had almost lost. The biting wind continued to swirl around them, but in that shared moment of grief and nascent hope, a flicker of warmth, a spark of something akin to understanding, passed between them. The biting wind whipped at Grant's overcoat, a stark contrast to the numb coldness that had settled deep in his bones. For days since they'd laid Marcus in this cold earth, for days since Grant had last allowed himself to feel anything other than the hollow echo of regret. He returned to the gravesite, drawn by an invisible tether, the unfinished business of a lifetime whispering in his ear. He'd expected solitude, a final, private farewell. But there, a splash of unexpected color against the gray backdrop of the cemetery, stood a young woman. Her back was to him, her posture suggesting a weariness that belied her youth. In her arms, bundled against the chill, she cradled a small form. Grant hesitated, the polished leather of his shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. He wasn't accustomed to intrusions, especially not in moments as private as this. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the wind. He took a tentative step closer. The click of the gate latched a small explosion in the otherwise silent afternoon. The woman turned, her face pale, framed by strands of dark hair that escaped her hood. Her eyes, wide and dark, met his. For a moment, they held each other's gaze, a silent conversation passing between them. Grant couldn't decipher the message, but it tugged at something deep within him, a flicker of recognition he couldn't place. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to retreat, to erase the intrusion, to preserve the carefully constructed wall of detachment he'd built around himself. She shifted, adjusting the bundle in her arms, and a small hand, impossibly tiny, emerged from the folds of the blanket. Grant's breath caught. The baby, for it was undoubtedly a baby, had a shock of dark hair, the exact shade of Marcus's. A disquieting sense of familiarity washed over him, a dizzying wave of something akin to recognition, yet utterly impossible. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask what? He didn't know. What could he possibly ask of this woman, a stranger, who stood vigil at his son's grave? "I loved your son," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying an unexpected strength. The words hung in the air, fragile yet potent, like the scent of the decaying flowers laid upon the freshly turned earth. "Excuse me," Grant managed, his voice a rasp, unfamiliar even to himself. He had imagined 1,000 scenarios for his final goodbye, none of which included this. This woman, this child. He glanced at the baby again, the tiny face now turned towards him, dark eyes blinking against the wind. The resemblance was uncanny. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. The woman took a step closer, her gaze unflinching. "And he loved me." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled back, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. Loved her? Marcus? The Marcus he knew, the son he'd failed to understand, the son who had always remained a distant, unknowable entity? He searched her face, searching for a lie, a fabrication, anything to dispel the unsettling truth her words carried. But there was only a quiet sorrow in her eyes, a depth of emotion that resonated with the unspoken grief he carried within himself. "Is that yours?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the question directed at the child nestled in her arms. He felt a strange pull towards the infant, a mix of fear and fascination he couldn't explain. She nodded, a single decisive movement. "His name is Calvin." Calvin, his grandson. The word felt foreign, alien on his tongue. He looked at the woman, really looked at her, seeing past the weariness and grief to the quiet strength that emanated from her. He saw the curve of her cheek, the faint lines etched around her eyes, the subtle tremble of her lips. He saw the love in her eyes, a love that mirrored the love he had felt for Marcus, a love he had buried beneath layers of expectation and disappointment. He felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, a sharp, stinging sensation behind his eyes. He blinked, willing it away. He wasn't a man given to displays of emotion. Certainly not here, not now. Tu didn't know, he stammered, the words inadequate, hollow. What did he not know? That his son was capable of love? That he had found happiness in a life Grant had dismissed as reckless and irresponsible? That he had created a life, a legacy, that Grant had been completely oblivious to? She offered a small, sad smile. He didn't want to disappoint you. The simple statement pierced through his defenses, shattering the carefully constructed image he had maintained for so long. Disappoint. The word echoed in his mind, a constant refrain throughout Marcus's life. He had pushed his son, molded him into the image of success he valued. Blind to the person Marcus was, the person he wanted to be. He stood there, the wind whipping around him, the cold seeping into his very core, and for the first time in years, he felt a crack in the icy facade he had built around his heart. He looked at Janelle, at the tiny life she held in her arms, and a wave of something akin to warmth, tentative and fragile, spread through him. It wasn't enough to thaw the frozen wasteland of his grief, but it was a start, a possibility. He wouldn't want you out here in the cold, Grant said, the words surprising even himself. They were clumsy, inadequate, but they were a bridge, a tentative offering in the vast expanse of their shared loss. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of hope, hesitant and uncertain, like a fragile seedling pushing through the hard earth. He reached out a hand, a gesture of acceptance, of reconciliation, of a future he hadn't imagined just moments before. "Come on," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's get you and Calvin home." The biting Ohio wind whipped at the edges of Grant's overcoat, a chilling echo of the emptiness that gnawed at him. For days since they'd laid Marcus in the cold earth, for days since Grant had last stood on this desolate patch of ground. He'd avoided it, just as he'd avoided Marcus for years. Work, he told himself, was the reason. Now, there was only silence, a silence punctuated by the mournful rustle of dried leaves skittering across the manicured lawn of the cemetery. He stared at the fresh mound of earth, the simple headstone a stark reminder of a life cut short, a relationship left unresolved. A faint scent of lilies, lingering from the funeral, mingled with the metallic tang of winter air. He'd sent a lavish spray, white lilies, Marcus's favorite. A gesture, really, a substitute for the years of genuine connection he hadn't offered. He hadn't expected to find anyone here. The funeral had been a small affair, a handful of business associates, a few distant relatives. And then her, the young woman with the tired eyes and the baby bundled in a thick blanket. She still stood by the grave, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on the headstone as though it held the answers to all the unasked questions swirling within her. He hadn't spoken to her at the funeral, hadn't known what to say. Now, he found his feet carrying him towards her, a reluctant magnetism pulling him closer. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the cold air. She turned, the movement slow and deliberate, her eyes, a striking shade of hazel, meeting his with a mixture of defiance and sorrow. He could see the faint tracks of tears on her cheeks, the raw grief etched into the lines around her mouth. He hesitated, the carefully constructed wall around his emotions threatening to crumble. "You said he loved you," Grant finally managed, the words clipped, sharper than he'd intended. The small bundle in her arms stirred, a tiny fist pushing out from beneath the blanket. He found his gaze drawn to it, to the miniature hand, so much like Marcus's. A fleeting expression, something akin to pain, flickered across her face. "He did," she responded, her voice quiet but firm, a thread of steel running through its softness. "More than anything. And this is?" He gestured awkwardly towards the baby, unable to articulate the question that was forming in his mind. "Our son," she replied, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "Marcus's son." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. His son, a grandson he hadn't known existed. He felt a strange lurch in his stomach, a mixture of disbelief and a nascent, unfamiliar warmth. He looked at the child again, really looked. The baby's face was mostly hidden by the blanket, but a wisp of dark hair, the same shade as Marcus's, peeked out. Doubt warred with a strange, burgeoning hope. "What's his name?" he asked, the words barely a whisper. "Calvin," she answered. Calvin, his father's name. The name he'd refused to give to Marcus, a silent rebellion against the weight of family expectations. A bitter irony twisted in his gut. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The words were a defense mechanism, a way to shield himself from the tidal wave of emotions threatening to engulf him. He knew, deep down, that he was already starting to believe. The child's resemblance to Marcus, the name, it was too much of a coincidence. She didn't flinch. "I'm not here for you," she said, her voice laced with a weariness that mirrored his own. "I came to say goodbye." She shifted the baby slightly, adjusting the blanket to reveal more of his face. Calvin's eyes, wide and dark, blinked up at him, a startling echo of Marcus's own intense gaze. Grant's breath caught in his throat. He could see it now, the unmistakable family resemblance in the curve of the baby's nose, the shape of his chin. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile he'd felt in days. He reached out a hesitant hand, wanting to touch the child, to connect with this tiny fragment of his son's life that he hadn't known existed. He stopped short, his hand hovering in the air. What right did he have? He wanted a different life, Janelle said softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. Away from all this. She gestured vaguely towards the city in the distance, towards the world of business and ambition that Grant had built, the world he had expected Marcus to inherit. A sharp pang of guilt shot through him. He'd pushed Marcus, pressured him to follow in his footsteps. He'd never considered that Marcus might want something different. He'd been so focused on his own vision of success that he'd been blind to his son's desires, his dreams. "He talked about you," Janelle continued, her gaze fixed on Calvin's face. He wished things had been different. The words were a punch to the gut. He'd known, of course, that Marcus had resented him. But hearing it now, from this young woman who had held his son's heart, the weight of his failures settled upon him, heavy and suffocating. He loved Calvin, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He wanted him to know his family. Grant looked at the tiny face nestled against Janelle's chest, at the innocent eyes that held no judgment, only a silent plea for connection. He felt a shift within him, a thawing of the ice that had encased his heart for so long. He'd failed Marcus, but perhaps he could still be a grandfather to Calvin. He took a step closer, his hand finally reaching out to gently touch the baby's cheek. Calvin's skin was soft and warm, a stark contrast to the biting wind and the cold stone of the headstone. He felt a strange warmth spread through him, a flicker of hope in the desolate landscape of his grief. He looked at Janelle, his gaze softening. "Tell me about him," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Tell me about my son." The biting Ohio wind whipped through the cemetery, rustling the dead, leaves clinging to the oak trees. Grant pulled his coat tighter, the chill seeping into his bones despite the heavy wool. For days since they'd laid Marcus to rest beneath the cold earth, and the weight of it felt no lighter. He stared at the polished granite headstone, the inscription stark against the gray sky. Marcus Ellison, beloved son. A bitter laugh caught in his throat. Beloved by whom? Certainly not by him. He'd built an empire, brick by painstaking brick, but in the process, he'd lost the one thing that truly mattered. He'd expected to be alone, to finally say the words he hadn't been able to utter at the funeral, choked by a grief he hadn't known he was capable of. But she was there again, the young woman with the sad eyes and the baby wrapped in a thick blanket. He hadn't paid her much attention at the service, dismissing her as a grieving friend, a colleague perhaps. Now, seeing her standing there, so small and vulnerable against the backdrop of the tombstones, a prickle of unease ran down his spine. "You came back," she said, her voice soft, a mere breath against the wind. He hadn't heard her approach. He nodded curtly, unsure what to say. Her presence felt like an intrusion, a violation of the private grief he was trying to wrestle with. Yet, There was something in her eyes, a quiet sorrow that mirrored his own, that held him captive. She shifted slightly, adjusting the baby in her arms. The small face, framed by a soft, knitted hat, peeked out from the folds of the blanket. And that's when Grant saw it, a flicker of familiarity that sent a jolt through him. The curve of the nose, the shape of the chin, it was like looking at a miniature version of Marcus. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind. He cleared his throat, the words forming with difficulty. Marcus, he never mentioned anyone. The young woman's gaze dropped to the baby in her arms, a faint smile playing on her lips. It was a sad smile, tinged with a weariness that seemed too heavy for someone so young. He was going to Mr. Ellison, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But your relationship with him, it made that complicated. Her words struck him like a physical blow. He'd always justified his distance, his demanding nature, as a necessary evil. He was preparing Marcus for the world, shaping him into the successor he needed him to be. He hadn't considered, not truly, the impact it had on his son. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he'd been too busy building an empire to notice the cracks forming in his own son's foundation? He didn't hate you, Mr. Ellison, she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. He just didn't know how to breathe around you. A wave of nausea washed over Grant. He'd always prided himself on his control, his ability to command any room, any situation. But with this young woman, with her quiet accusation, he felt stripped bare, exposed. She reached in her bag, pulling out a small, worn photo album. "These are for you," she said, offering it to him. His fingers brushed against hers as he took it, the contact sending an unexpected jolt through him. He opened the album, his breath catching in his throat. Pictures of Marcus, smiling, laughing, alive. Pictures he'd never seen. Pictures with her, the young woman, her face radiant with love. Pictures with the baby, his grandson, his tiny fingers wrapped around Marcus's. Each photo was a stab to the heart, a testament to the life he'd missed, the joy he'd denied himself. He flipped through the pages, his mind reeling. Photos of birthday celebrations, family dinners, quiet moments shared between a father and his son. A life he'd been oblivious to, a life that existed just beyond his reach. There were also messages, texts from Marcus, filled with a mixture of love, frustration, and a desperate longing for connection. "Dad, can we talk? Just wanted to share this with you. Maybe next weekend?" Each unanswered message, each missed opportunity, was a heavy stone added to the burden of his regret. He closed the album, his hands trembling. He looked up at the young woman, her face etched with a sadness that mirrored his own. "His name is Calvin," she said softly, gesturing towards the baby. Calvin Ellison. The name resonated within him, a fragile thread connecting him to the son he'd lost, to the future he'd almost thrown away. He reached out, a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against Calvin's soft cheek. The baby stirred, his small hand grasping Grant's finger. A wave of emotion washed over him, a potent mixture of grief, regret, and a flicker of something akin to hope. He looked at Janelle, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I didn't know." She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know." The wind continued to howl around them, but for the first time since Marcus's death, Grant felt a glimmer of warmth. He looked at Janelle, at Calvin, and knew that he couldn't change the past. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could salvage a future he hadn't realized he had. The biting Ohio wind whipped at the edges of Grant's expensive overcoat, a stark contrast to the numbness that had settled within him. For days since they'd laid Marcus in this cold earth, and still, the reality hadn't broken through the frozen surface of his grief. He'd come back, driven by a compulsion he couldn't quite name. Closure? Perhaps. Or maybe just the morbid curiosity of a man surveying the wreckage of his own failings. The headstone, stark white against the gray sky, seemed to mock him with its simple inscription, Marcus Ellison. Beloved son, beloved. The word echoed in the hollow chambers of Grant's heart, a bitter irony that twisted in his gut. He hadn't been a beloved father, not even close. The young woman hadn't moved. She stood as if rooted to the spot, a small, bundled figure nestled in her arms. The child, he realized with a jolt, was the spitting image of Marcus at that age. The same unruly dark hair, the same slightly crooked nose. He could almost see Marcus's mischievous grin reflected in the baby's sleeping face. A wave of nausea washed over him, a sickening blend of grief and disbelief. He was a grandfather who hadn't even known his son had a child. He looks just like him. Grant finally managed, the words scraping against his throat like sandpaper. His gaze remained fixed on the child, afraid to look at the woman, afraid of what he might see in her eyes. Accusation? Disgust? Janelle shifted slightly, the baby stirring in her arms. "Calvin," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "His name is Calvin." She finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, but surprisingly devoid of animosity. There was a weariness there, a deep sadness that mirrored his own, but something else too. A quiet strength, a resolve. It unsettled him. This woman, this waitress, this stranger, held a piece of Marcus that he'd never known existed. A piece that he now realized he desperately craved. A silence descended, heavy and suffocating. The wind howled through the barren trees, a mournful dirge that seemed to amplify the emptiness within him. He should say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his regret. He'd been so busy building his empire, so consumed by the pursuit of success, that he'd let his son slip through his fingers. He'd traded presence for presence, connection for control, and now it was too late. "He told me stories about you," Janelle said softly, breaking the oppressive silence. Her voice was tinged with a strange mix of sadness and fondness. It was unsettling, this unexpected tenderness toward the man who had clearly failed his son. Grant flinched. Stories? What stories could Marcus have possibly told about a father who was more phantom than flesh and blood? He braced himself for the inevitable accusations, the litany of his shortcomings. But Janelle's next words weren't what he expected. "He used to say you were the smartest man he knew. He admired you." A sharp pang of guilt shot through him. Admiration. A hollow, empty word when it came from a son who had felt so unseen. He swallowed hard, trying to dislodge the lump that had formed his throat. Mayhay never told me anything." Janelle's gaze held his, steady and unwavering. "He never told me he was afraid of you." The words struck him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Afraid? Marcus, his son, had been afraid of him? The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave, washing away the carefully constructed walls of denial he'd built around himself. He swayed slightly, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady himself against a nearby headstone. Grant's mind raced, scrambling to reconcile this image of his son afraid, unseen with the confident, albeit distant, young man he thought he knew. He justified his emotional detachment as strength, his lack of involvement as respect for Marcus's independence. But what if it had been fear all along? Fear of rejection, fear of disappointing the man he'd placed on such a high pedestal. The thought was unbearable. "Afraid," he repeated, the word a broken whisper. The image of Marcus as a small boy, clinging to his leg, flashed through his mind. When had that boy stopped reaching out? When had he learned to fear the very person who should have been his sanctuary? Janelle watched him, her expression unreadable. "He wasn't afraid of you," she corrected gently, her voice soft but firm. "He just never felt seen by you." He closed his eyes, the truth of her words searing through him. Seen. He'd provided for Marcus materially, given him everything he could possibly want, but he'd never truly seen him. He'd never bothered to look past the surface, to understand the young man his son was becoming. He'd been so focused on shaping Marcus into the image of success he'd envisioned, that he'd failed to see the person Marcus actually was. The person he wanted to be. He told me he didn't want your life," Janelle continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't want to survive. He wanted to live." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Life, a simple word, yet it resonated with a power that shook him to his core. He'd spent his life chasing success, accumulating wealth, building an empire. He thought he was teaching Marcus how to survive, how to thrive in a cutthroat world. But Marcus hadn't wanted to survive. He'd wanted to live, to experience life, to find joy in the simple things, to connect with people on a deeper level. The things Grant had dismissed as frivolous, as distractions from the real work of building a legacy. He looked at Janelle, at the sleeping child in her arms, and a wave of understanding washed over him. This was Marcus's legacy. This tiny life, this quiet moment of connection, was more valuable than all the wealth and power he'd amassed. He had failed his son, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could still make amends. He could still be a grandfather to this child, a presence in Calvin's life that he hadn't been in Marcus's. He took a shaky breath, the icy air burning in his lungs. Can I hold him?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns of the cemetery, painting the marble headstones in a melancholic hue. Grant Ellison stood before his son's freshly laid grave, the polished granite reflecting the dying light back at him like a cold, accusing eye. For days since they'd laid Marcus to rest, and the weight of it still pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of grief and regret. He hadn't truly known his son. Not really. The realization was a bitter pill, lodged in his throat like unshed tears. He pulled a worn leather-bound photo album from his briefcase, his fingers tracing the embossed initials on the cover. It was Janelle's, offered as a fragile bridge across the chasm of his ignorance. He flipped through the pages, each image a snapshot into a life he hadn't been privy to. Marcus, beaming, holding a tiny, squirming bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Marcus, laughing, pushing a stroller through a sun-dappled park. Marcus, his eyes filled with a tenderness Grant had rarely witnessed, gazing at the same child, now a toddler, giggling as he chased pigeons. Each photograph was a stab of guilt, a reminder of the moments he'd missed, the connection they could have had. He hadn't known his son had a child. A son. The thought resonated with a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest. He closed the album, the leather cool against his palm. He looked up at Janelle, who stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped protectively around the small boy. He'd initially dismissed her presence as the misguided affection of a grieving friend, a fleeting connection in his son's transient life. But the boy was a miniature replica of Marcus. The same dark, inquisitive eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. The resemblance was undeniable, a living, breathing testament to a love he'd been blind to. How Grant started, his voice raspy and used. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations and self-recrimination. How do I know this baby is mine? The words felt cold, even to his own ears, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. He needed to know, needed to have the truth laid bare, even if it ripped him apart. Janelle met his gaze, her expression a mixture of weariness and quiet defiance. "He is," she stated simply, her voice devoid of any pleading or defensiveness. She shifted the boy in her arms, revealing his face more fully. "His name is Calvin. Marcouche loved him very much." A wave of dizziness washed over Grant. Loved him. The past tense, a constant reminder of the finality of death, of the future stolen from both father and son. He reached out, a trembling hand, drawn to the child by an invisible force. Can I hold him?" The request felt alien, a plea for connection he hadn't realized he craved. Janelle hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face before she gently placed Calvin in his arms. The child was surprisingly light, his small body warm against Grant's chest. He stared down at the boy, at the tiny hand that instinctively curled around his finger. He looked up at Janelle, his gaze questioning. "Marcus," she began, her voice catching slightly. "He wanted Calvin to have both, a mother and a father. He talked about wanting you to meet him, to be a part of his life." A lump formed in Grant's throat, constricting his airway. He looked back down at Calvin, tracing the soft curve of his cheek with a trembling finger. The baby gurgled, his dark eyes wide and curious, unburdened by the weight of grief and regret that suffocated the adults around him. He'd spent his life building empires, accumulating wealth, chasing success, all the while neglecting the most important thing: his family, his son. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and reeling. "He's got his eyes," Grant whispered, the words barely audible. The observation was trivial, yet profound. A tangible link to the son he'd lost, a connection forged in the shared gaze of a grandchild he'd just met. Janelle nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "He does," she agreed softly. "He's got a lot of Marcus in him." She paused, then added, "He would have loved this, seeing you holding him." Grant tightened his hold on Calvin, a strange, protective instinct surging through him. He didn't know what the future held, what his relationship with this young woman and his grandson would be. But in that moment, standing amongst the silent stones and the whispering wind, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember of connection in the vast emptiness of his grief. He looked at Janelle, his gaze no longer cold and distant, but softened by a shared sorrow and a tentative promise. "Tell me about him," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tell me everything." He needed to know. He needed to bridge the gap, to build a connection he'd foolishly let slip away. He owed it to Marcus. He owed it to Calvin. He owed it to himself. The weight on his chest hadn't lifted entirely, but in the small, warm body nestled in his arms, he felt the first, hesitant thaw of a long-frozen heart. The biting Ohio wind whipped around Grant, a chilling echo of the emptiness that gnawed at him. For days since they laid Marcus to rest beneath the unforgiving earth of Toledo Memorial Park, and the weight on Grant's chest hadn't lessened. The granite headstone, stark and new, seemed to mock him with its finality. Marcus Ellison, 1992 to 2023, a life condensed to 2 dates, a life Grant barely knew. He reached out a gloved hand, tracing the cold, etched letters. He hadn't been a good father. The thought, familiar and sharp, pierced through the fog of grief. He'd been distant, preoccupied with building his empire, blinded by the illusion of providing for his son instead of truly being there for him. He would have liked this. A soft voice broke through his reverie. Grant turned, the words snagging on the edges of his guilt. Janelle stood a few feet away, the baby nestled close to her chest, a tiny face peeking out from the folds of a thick blanket. She looked even more fragile than she had at the funeral, the weariness etched deep into the shadows beneath her eyes. A part of him, the cold, practical part, wanted to retreat, to avoid the awkwardness, the unspoken accusations he saw in her gaze. Yet, something held him rooted to the spot. The baby, perhaps. The small, perfect replica of the son he'd failed. He loved the quiet, Janelle continued, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "He'd bring me here sometimes just to sit and think." A flicker of what might have been a smile touched her lips, then vanished as quickly as it appeared. "He talked about you, you know." Grant's throat tightened. He wanted to believe her, to grasp onto the hope that Marcus, despite everything, had still cared. "What did he say?" he asked, the words rough around the edges. Janelle shifted her weight, the baby stirring in her arms. "He said you were a good man, just lost." Her gaze, direct and unwavering, held his. "He worried about you. Lost." The word reverberated in Grant's mind, a cruel irony. He, the successful CEO, the man who had everything, was lost. Lost in the labyrinth of his own making. He had built walls so high, even his own son couldn't scale them. He looked at the baby, at the tiny hand reaching out from the blanket, grasping at the empty air. "He looks just like him," Grant managed, his voice thick with emotion. An unfamiliar ache, a primal tug, pulsed in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to touch the child, but hesitated, unsure if he had the right. Janelle followed his gaze. "His name is Calvin," she said softly. "Marcus wanted to name him Grant, after you." The words landed like a blow to the gut. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, so oblivious to the life Marcus had built, the life he had been denied a part of. "Tu didn't know," he stammered, the words inadequate, pathetic. A bitter laugh escaped Janelle's lips. "You didn't know a lot of things about your son, Mr. Ellison." The formality, the edge in her voice, stung. He deserved it. He deserved every ounce of her resentment. Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the mournful whistle of the wind. Grant wrestled with a torrent of emotions: guilt, regret, a burgeoning sense of responsibility. He looked at Janelle, at the exhaustion etched on her young face, and a question, one he had been avoiding since the funeral, formed on his lips. He had to ask, even if the answer shattered what little composure he had left. "If Marcus were still here," he began, his voice barely audible, "and he told you about me and Calvin, would you have accepted it?" Janelle looked away, her gaze fixed on the headstone. The silence stretched, each second a lifetime. Grant braced himself for rejection, for the confirmation of his failure as a father. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "I might have fought it," she admitted, "but I think eventually I would have come around. For Marcus, for Calvin." A fragile hope bloomed in Grant's chest. He took a step closer, drawn by an invisible thread to the woman and child who represented everything he had lost and everything he could still gain. "I want to be there for him," he said, the words raw and honest. "For you, if you'll let me." Janelle met his gaze, her eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of uncertainty, a trace of the pain he had caused. But he also saw something else, a glimmer of hope, a possibility of forgiveness. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew he had a lifetime of amends to make. But for the first time in a long time, Grant felt a sense of purpose, a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness of his grief. He had lost a son, but he had found a grandson. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to be the father he should have been, the grandfather Calvin deserved. The wind continued to howl around them, a constant reminder of the harsh realities of life and death. But within the small circle they formed, a fragile warmth began to grow, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the possibility of redemption. The gravel crunched beneath Grant's polished shoes, each footfall a stark counterpoint to the soft whisper of the drizzle that had begun to fall. Toledo's gray sky wept a miserly rain, mirroring the damp chill that had settled deep in his bones. He hadn't realized how heavy the silence of the cemetery could be until Janelle fell in a step beside him, the infant nestled securely in her arms. The tiny face, so heartbreakingly familiar, was turned away, tucked against her shoulder. He could see the delicate curve of the baby's ear, translucent against the dull fabric of her coat, and the image resonated with an unnerving echo of Marcus. He shifted his gaze, a flicker of unease tightening his chest. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and something faintly floral, perhaps from the wilting bouquet he'd left earlier. He wondered if this was how Marcus had smelled as a baby, a phantom scent lost to the passage of time. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic tap of the rain against the leaves of the ancient oaks lining the path. Each step felt like traversing a minefield of unspoken words, of emotions too raw to articulate. Grant ran a hand over his face, the prickle of his unshaven beard a stark contrast to the smoothness of his palm. He was used to the controlled environment of his office, the predictable dance of figures and forecasts. This was a different kind of battlefield, one where his usual weapons of logic and detachment were useless. He glanced sideways at Janelle. Her face was pale, etched with a weariness that went beyond simple grief. A strand of dark hair had escaped her braid, clinging damply to her cheek. He could almost feel the weight of her sorrow, a palpable presence in the humid air. He wondered, fleetingly, how a woman so young could bear such a burden with such quiet dignity. He loved this place. Janelle's voice, soft as the falling rain, broke the silence. He wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to the air, to the ghost of Marcus that surely lingered here. He felt a sudden, unexpected pang of envy. This woman, a stranger until a few hours ago, shared a connection with his son that he could only dream of. Grant cleared his throat, the sound rough and unfamiliar. Did he? He found he couldn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the gray blur of the path ahead. Yeah, she said, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. He used to come here to think. He said it was peaceful. A pause, then, almost as an afterthought. He talked about you sometimes. The words landed like a blow to the gut. He talked about me. Grant's mind recoiled, scrambling to grasp the implications. What had Marcus said? Had he spoken of resentment, of the chasm that had grown between them over the years? He clenched his fists, the nails digging into his palms. He should have been there, should have bridged that chasm, should have he swallowed hard, the unspoken words clogging his throat. He never mentioned anyone. He finally managed, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. Janelle shifted the baby in her arms, the movement small and hesitant. He kept things to himself, she said, her voice laced with a quiet understanding that grated on him. How could she, a virtual stranger, understand his son better than he did? The thought twisted inside him, a bitter cocktail of grief and self-reproach. He stopped abruptly, the sudden halt forcing Janelle to pause beside him. The drizzle had intensified, clinging to his coat like a second skin. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the faint shadows under her eyes, the subtle lines of worry etched around her mouth, and the quiet strength that radiated from her despite her evident exhaustion. He saw the love in her eyes as she looked down at the sleeping infant, a love that mirrored the love he had once felt for Marcus, a love that had become buried under layers of ambition and misplaced expectations. He drew a shaky breath. What were you like with him when he was a kid? Her question, so unexpected, so disarmingly simple, caught him off guard. Strict. The word escaped his lips before he could stop it, a stark, single syllable that hung in the rain-soaked air. He closed his eyes briefly, the image of a young Marcus, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, flashing through his mind. He remembered the endless hours spent at the office, the missed birthdays, the school plays he hadn't attended. He justified it all, convinced himself that he was providing, that he was building a future for them, a future that Marcus clearly hadn't wanted. I used to think money was the answer to everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't want what I was offering. The admission was a painful splinter, lodged deep in his heart. He opened his eyes, meeting Janelle's gaze. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet understanding that unsettled him even more. She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the baby in her arms. He just wanted connection, she murmured, her voice barely audible above the gentle drumming of the rain. He wanted to be seen. The words resonated with a chilling accuracy. He had been so focused on providing for Marcus, on shaping him into the image of success he had envisioned, that he had failed to see the person his son was becoming. He had built walls of expectation and ambition, brick by brick, until they stood impenetrable between them. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves and carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of rain. Grant shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him. He felt a profound sense of loss, a gaping emptiness that went beyond the grief of losing a son. It was the loss of a lifetime of unspoken words, of missed opportunities, of a connection that had withered from neglect. He looked at Janelle, at the tiny, sleeping face nestled against her chest, and a flicker of something akin to hope ignited within him. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to rebuild, to forge a new connection, not as father and son, but as grandfather and grandson. It was a fragile hope, as delicate as the falling rain, but it was there, a small spark in the vast darkness of his grief. He took a step closer to Janelle, the unspoken question hanging between them, a silent plea for forgiveness, for understanding, for a second chance. The rain continued to fall, washing over the silent graves, a gentle, cleansing rain that promised a new beginning. The wind whispered through the leaves of the ancient oak, a melancholic sigh that seemed to echo Grant's own unspoken grief. For days. It had only been 4 days since they laid Marcus to rest beneath the cold, unforgiving earth, and yet the weight of those 4 days pressed upon Grant like the granite tombstone before him. He'd avoided this place, this finality, until now. Until the guilt clawed at him, a relentless reminder of all the unspoken words, the unbridged distances between him and his son. He ran a hand over the cool stone, the engraved name a stark confirmation of a reality he still couldn't fully grasp. Marcus, his son, gone. He'd built an empire, a testament to his ambition and drive, but what use was any of it now? What legacy was a mountain of wealth if the most precious part of him was buried 6 feet under? A soft sniffle broke through the desolate silence. Grant turned, his gaze settling on a young woman standing beneath the oak's outstretched limbs. She held a bundle close, a small face peeking out from the folds of a worn blanket. He hadn't seen her at the funeral. An unsettling premonition coiled in his gut. "Excuse me," he began, his voice a rasp, and used from days of suppressed emotion. Were you a friend of Marcus's?" The woman lifted her head, revealing eyes red-rimmed and swollen, yet holding a spark of defiance. "More than a friend," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze shifted to the bundle in her arms, and a wave of weariness washed over her features. "This is Calvin, Marcus's son." The word struck Grant like a physical blow. A son? Marcus had a son? His mind reeled, struggling to process the information. He looked at the infant, at the small, perfect features, the curve of his nose, the shape of his chin, an uncanny echo of Marcus's own. A knot tightened in his chest, a strange mixture of disbelief and something akin to wonder. Grant began, his voice catching in his throat. He reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers hovering over the baby's soft cheek. The woman, Janelle, watched him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something she wasn't sure she'd find. "He looks just like him, doesn't he?" she murmured, a faint smile touching her lips. It was a smile tinged with sadness, a smile that spoke of memories both cherished and lost. Grant nodded, unable to speak. He saw Marcus in that tiny face, in a way Calvin's small hand instinctively curled around his finger. A pang of regret, sharp and piercing, shot through him. All the missed opportunities, the years wasted on building walls instead of bridges. "You're his grandfather, aren't you?" Janelle asked, her voice regaining a sliver of its strength. Grant swallowed, the words heavy in his mouth. "Yes," he finally managed. "Yes, I am." A long silence hung between them, the wind rustling the leaves like a whispered conversation. Janelle shifted her weight, the baby stirring in her arms. "I wanted him to know his father," she said, her gaze fixed on Calvin. "Even if it's just this place, this connection." Grant looked from Janelle to the child in her arms. He could see the exhaustion etched on her face, the silent plea in her eyes. An unfamiliar emotion tugged at him, something that felt strangely like protectiveness. Would you like to hold him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Grant hesitated for a fraction of a second, a lifetime of emotional restraint warring with this sudden, unexpected pull. He extended his arms, a tremor running through them. Janelle carefully placed Calvin in his arms. The baby was surprisingly light, yet the weight of him felt monumental. Grant held him close, feeling the warmth of his small body against his chest. A connection, a primal surge of something he hadn't felt, not even with Marcus himself. "He's really mine," he whispered, the words barely audible. A tear, hot and unwelcome, traced a path down his cheek. Janelle smiled, a genuine smile this time, a flicker of hope in her weary eyes. "He is," she said softly, "and he needs you." The words resonated deep within Grant, shaking the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. He looked down at Calvin, at the innocent face so like his son's. This wasn't about him. This wasn't about the past, or the regrets, or the missed opportunities. This was about the future, about this small, fragile life entrusted to his care. "This isn't a second shot at being a father," Janelle said, as if reading his thoughts. "It's your first shot at being a grandfather." Grant met her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. He knew she was right. This wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about creating a new narrative, a new beginning. He took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Janelle placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You'll learn," she said gently. "Just be there. That's all that matters." "I want to be," Grant said, his voice firm now, resolute. "I don't want him to grow up thinking I'm a stranger." He looked down at Calvin, at the tiny hand grasping his finger. In that moment, something shifted within Grant. The ice around his heart, frozen for so long, began to thaw. He felt a flicker of warmth, a fragile ember of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Maybe he could still learn how to love, how to connect, how to be the man he should have been all along. Not for himself, but for this tiny, precious life in his arms. For Marcus. For Calvin. For the future he hadn't known he wanted until now. The biting November wind whipped around Grant, tugging at the lapels of his overcoat. He hadn't felt the cold at the graveside, numbed by the surreal weight of the past few days. But now, walking back towards the car, the chill seeped into his bones, mirroring the icy dread that had settled in his gut. He glanced at the young woman beside him, the baby bundled tightly in her arms. Janelle, a name that was now inextricably linked to his son, to the grandson he'd never known existed. He'd offered her a ride, an automatic courtesy that felt grotesquely inadequate in the face of the seismic shift in his world. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes. Each footfall felt like another step further away from Marcus, from the possibility of ever truly knowing him. He fumbled in his pocket for his car keys, the metal cold against his skin. "I still can't believe it," he finally managed, the words raspy, inadequate. Janelle's gaze, previously fixed on the path ahead, lifted to meet his. There was a weariness in her eyes that belied her youth, a deep-seated sorrow that resonated with his own. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. It's like a bad dream." He unlocked the car, the beep echoing in the quiet of the cemetery. As Janelle settled into the passenger seat, carefully positioning the sleeping infant, a fresh wave of guilt washed over Grant. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, his own grief, that he hadn't truly considered hers. He had barely acknowledged the tiny life cradled in her arms, the tangible, breathing legacy of his son. He started the engine, the hum a low counterpoint to the wind. Marcus never mentioned, he never said anything about. His voice trailed off, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Janelle turned to face him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "He was coming home to surprise me," she said softly, the words catching in her throat. That night, the night of the accident, he was coming home. The words hit Grant like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. Coming home, not to the grand house where Grant lived, surrounded by the trappings of his success, but to her, to this young woman and their child, a family he hadn't even known existed. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, trying to process the enormity of the revelation. "Coming home, why?" he managed, the words barely a whisper. Janelle's gaze dropped to the baby in her arms, a faint smile touching her lips. "He had the lease. For our new apartment. He was going to surprise me. A new apartment. A life together." A future Marcus had been building, separate and apart from the one Grant had envisioned for him. A future that had been brutally, senselessly stolen. Grant closed his eyes, the weight of his regret crushing him. He'd always justified his distance from Marcus, telling himself that he was giving him space, letting him find his own way. But now, staring at the undeniable proof of the life his son had built, he saw the gaping chasm of his own neglect. He had been so busy building his empire, accumulating wealth, that he had failed to build a relationship with his son. He thought he had more time. "I thought I had more time," he murmured, the words heavy with the unspoken weight of his remorse. Janelle nodded, her eyes filled with a profound sadness that mirrored his own. "We both did," she whispered. The drive back was a blur, the silence between them now filled with the unspoken ghosts of what might have been. Grant's mind raced, replaying snippets of memories, searching for clues he'd missed, for signs of the life Marcus had kept hidden. He remembered the late-night phone calls, the hushed conversations, dismissed as youthful indiscretions. Now he saw them for what they were: a son trying to protect his own fragile happiness, a father too blind to see it. He pulled up in front of a small, unassuming diner, the neon sign flickering in the twilight. "This is where I work," Janelle said, her voice hesitant. Grant nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the gulf that separated them. But the words wouldn't come. He could only offer her a small, awkward smile, a gesture that felt woefully insufficient. Janelle carefully unbuckled the baby, her movements slow and deliberate. As she turned to leave, she paused, her hand resting on the car door. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, for coming." Grant swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "Thank you," he managed, finally finding his voice. For telling me." He watched as she walked towards the diner, the baby cradled securely in her arms. The neon sign cast a warm glow around her, illuminating the weariness in her face, the quiet strength in her posture. And in that moment, Grant knew that he couldn't walk away. He couldn't erase the past, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could build a future, however different it might be from the one he'd imagined. He had a grandson now, a tangible, breathing link to the son he'd lost. And that, he realized, was a connection he couldn't afford to break.